Welcome to episode number 59 of 100 Plus, an overview of 100 of the most important people, events, and ideas of the last 2,000 years. This is a survey of the forces and factors that have shaped today's world, Western civilization, the Christian faith, and you. Our hope is that by tracing the path that led up to this moment, we will not only better understand what is going on and why, but we will also be able to live more thoughtfully and faithfully today. Our topic today, broadly speaking, is Romanticism, the 18th century reaction to Enlightenment rationalism. It was an artistic and intellectual movement that started in Western Europe in the mid-18th century and spread throughout the West. The Romantics were a group of artists and philosophers asserting the importance of emotion, beauty, and nature in a world that was increasingly rational, practical, and industrialized. As Christians, there is much that we can learn from a careful study of Romanticism. Today we step back from thinking about America, its formation, revivals, and revolutionary ethos. We step back from overviews of capitalism and higher education to look at art and literature. We will give a bit of attention to a few of the leading players in those categories and quite a bit of attention to the movement called Romanticism. Now, those of you who are into romance novels or rom-coms, those of you who are drawn to sunsets and prom dates and holding hands and, I don't know, pictures of Cupid and candlelight dinners and all that, you might be wondering how exactly this is one of the topics for our overview of world history. Well, that's because while etymologically romance and the Romantics are related, the Romantics, the Romantic era, the Romantic ethos is a whole lot bigger than Valentine's Day. So as mentioned, we're going to be looking at some of the artistic leaders, musicians like Bach, Beethoven, painters like Van Gogh, but we're also going to be driving down on the worldview that shaped them. As we moved through the 18th century and begin to drift into the 19th century, one of the major cultural forces that was in play, that was shaping the arts, that was shaping literature, that was shaping the way people were living, was this movement called Romanticism. And though it is famously hard to define, and all the historians and philosophers and art historians that you read all talk about and complain about how remarkably difficult it is to define. What is clear is that it was an important pushback, a reaction to the Enlightenment ideas and ideals that had swept across the land and had moved out of Europe and really out of Western Europe and gone on from there. Romanticism is the name given to the orientation that bristles at cold rationalism and instead celebrates feelings and our imagination and our passions and our individual expressions. Romanticism was, and arguably it still is, there's a sense in which we're all romantics today. We see some of this in particular with postmodernity, but Romanticism was a reaction against the modern, bureaucratic, sterile, planned, rational, organized world that emerged out of the Enlightenment. And it was an approach to life that favored a more spontaneous, free-flowing, childlike, emotional, passionate response to life. So, while Romanticism is a movement that is much broader than the stuff that inspires Hallmark cards, when you hear terms like, passion and free expression of your heart and all those things, you can see how the term romance emerges out of this idea of the Romantic era. And all that ties back to Rome and some etymological words back with Rome, which of course would make sense. So anyway, we're looking at this movement for two reasons. One, because it is a significant pushback on the Enlightenment. And in order to understand what is coming next, there's really not simply going to be the Enlightenment ethos. There is the church, but you also have in culture, you have a pushback on the Enlightenment, and that is the Romantics. But also because as we move forward, culture becomes a bigger and bigger factor in how people are living and thinking. Global culture becomes a bigger factor. Culture is always important. And by culture, I mean the vibe, right? The approach, the associations, the understanding of the arts, customs, all those things. So many Christians, when they talk about culture, it's always has a pejorative overtone. Culture's bad. That's unfortunate. That's a very limited way to think about culture. If you've not read Andy Crouch's book, Culture Making, I would recommend that to you. He has a different approach and spin on all this. But what I'm getting at is that there will, in the future, there's going to be more to say and more to observe about cultural trends and their impact on us. So here, it's pretty easy to note something that happens with cultures. So the Enlightenment pushes, we'll say, to the left, and if you were alive at that time, then you have got all of that push. But then the next thing that comes along pushes to the right. And if you were alive at that time, you've got all of this stuff that is shaping and influencing you. So we are profoundly shaped by what some could consider an accident of the times. And so it's important that we are living aware of our culture, but in one sense also above it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So we're going to start just by noting some of the artists, musicians, and others that were around and that sort of help lead us into Romanticism. So in an earlier episode, I talked about artists and I talked about the importance of art. This is back when we were moving into the Renaissance with Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel, and you've got, Raphael and Donatello and Da Vinci and Titian and all of those. And I talked for some time about the intersection of faith and art and how important that is. And I noted that this might be surprising, especially to Protestants who have not done as much with art as Catholics and Orthodox have, but that beauty and creativity and all of these things are very important to God and to the church. I then played around with definitions of art, talked about the various media that could be used, not just oil painting, but also various ink drawings, and then beyond that, noting that art is captured by all kinds of other disciplines, music and architecture and literature and plays and fashion and more. I noted that artistic expression is generally always changing. I think it's perhaps easiest to see this with music and how music changes. I raced through a variety of different eras of art and how much art was distinctive, medieval art versus Renaissance art versus Baroque and neoclassical and Romantic. There's our term. Romantic is an era of art. Realism, Impressionism, Expressionism, Surrealism, abstract, and more. And then, and this was all back in this earlier lecture, I had some things to say about how much art is religious, noting that you go to the big museums like the National Gallery, it's like a third of the art in the National Gallery is Christian art. And then I listed 8 reasons why we all should care about art. So all of that is in that previous lecture. So that sets us up to be alert to 2 things today. First, the 18th century, so the 1700s, was an important period for artists. In terms of musicians, there were big names on the classical scene. So Handel, and Bach, and Mozart, and Beethoven. So George Handel and Sebastian Bach, Johann Sebastian Bach, were both born, they didn't meet each other, both born in 1865, and they both had a deep faith in Christ. Handel did a lot initially with opera, which was unfortunate because it was falling out of favor, and so he ends up in trying to stay out of debtor's prison and in poor health. And he continues to do, like many artists, he does what he wants to do, not what is selling. And he comes into this different way of creating music that is not going to be opera, but is going to be sort of performed by choirs and sometimes tied to themes. And of course, we're going to get Handel's Messiah at this point. For what it's worth, he got a lot of pushback from the church that did not appreciate the fact that he was using biblical texts, because that's what the lyrics to Handel's Messiah are coming from Scripture, but using biblical text in the theater. So they considered this to be a little bit scandalous. He went ahead and did it, and of course, the world is glad. Bach, who was a child prodigy, also had some challenges in terms of making a go of it. He was more noted in his lifetime as an organist, and some of the music that he wrote, and he wrote lots and lots and lots of music. He was always sort of a church organist, and he would write and do arrangements. But as a rule, the people at church thought his music was too ostentatious, too flowery, it drew too much attention to itself. And they wanted simpler kinds of music. And so he's not really honored as a composer until about 80 to 100 years after his death, when Mendelssohn finds some of his music, some of the scores that he had left, and performs it, and then suddenly there's this explosion of interest in Bach. And he's sometimes referred to as the fifth evangelist, which is sort of lots of people. Like if you go to Jerusalem, they say the rocks are the fifth gospel, that you study the landscape, and that's telling you about the life of Jesus. So this idea of the fifth gospel, the first four, of course, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But Bach writes a lot of music and always signs it sola de gloria, right? Completely to the glory of God. So there were other composers at this time, classical composers. Two of them that come a little bit later, and though they're linked to religious music, were not nearly, we don't think that their faith in Christ was anything like that of Bach or of Handel. One of them is Mozart. He's born in 1756. He's a nominal member of the Roman Catholic Church, but he appears to be a little bit more of a Gnostic in some of his orientation. And then Beethoven is born in 1770, also a great musician and composer, seems to have relatively little interest in Christ. But he is great to bring up here because he is a good segue into Romanticism. His Fifth Symphony is considered by some to be the high water mark of romantic kinds of music. It had a lot of passion and a lot of intensity. People had never heard this kind of music before. One of his contemporaries wrote that Beethoven's music, quote, moves the levers that open the floodgates of fear, terror, of horror, of pain, and arouses the longing for the eternal, which is the essence of Romanticism. So more than anybody else to that date, Beethoven's music was considered to be a link to an expression or an outpouring of his personality. So that's a good segue into Romanticism, but before we make that jump, let me note that there are other prominent people, just to keep you sort of in the slipstream of things. We're in the 18th century, this is the 1700s, we've already talked about Enlightenment thinkers. Hume, Montesquieu, Hobbes, John Locke. We've talked about some of the religious leaders at this time, so the Wesley brothers and Jonathan Edwards and also Whitefield. We've looked at the founders of the founders of the United States, so Washington and Jefferson and Hamilton and Adams and Franklin and others. This is the time a little bit later in the 18th century. This is when we get into the French Revolution, 1789. So we've got those players, Robespierre and Napoleon. There were others that are worth noting that I've not brought up. For instance, in terms of music, this is when Isaac Watts, the English hymn writer, who wrote When I Survey the Wondrous Cross and also Joy to the World, he was born in 1674 and lived until 1740. And this kind of hymnody is new. Remember, music changes a lot as you go over the last 2,000 years. And up until the Reformation, through the Middle Ages, a lot of the music was not congregational at all. It was just, it was the clergy that was performing it. And then Luther changes that, but then you've got development and you've got all kinds of pushback on different kinds of instrumentation being brought in. So we've got Isaac Watts, we've got scientists and industrialists and explorers coming onto the scene. So James Watts is going to bring the steam engine out around this time. James Cook is going to be a great British navigator, sailor, cartographer. You've got some writers that are important. Daniel Defoe, who wrote Robinson Crusoe, which I recommended a couple weeks ago to somebody, and I was not surprised when they were surprised at what a profoundly Christian book Robinson Crusoe is. Same kind of nautical theme. You've got Gulliver's Travels. Jane Austen will be writing around this time, Pride and Prejudice, Sense and Sensibility, and a number of others. So there are other people we could call out. William Wilberforce is the politician and abolitionist, is somebody who is born around this time. William Blake, the poet and the artist, is born in the 1700s. But both Blake and Wilberforce are really going to make their mark in the 1800s, so we'll pick them up later on. Same with Mary Shelley, a profound romantic writer. She wrote Frankenstein when she was 19, by the way. Oh my goodness. That's just unthinkable. But also Victor Hugo, Les Mis, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, as I'll explain in a little bit. These are mostly 19th century figures. But Romanticism gets its start in the 18th century, but it's really going to come into its fullness in the 19th century. With that, let me pivot now to the idea of Romanticism, which I said is hard to define, but let me tease it out for you. I've already noted that it is an artistic and intellectual movement that starts in Western Europe in the 18th century and then spreads beyond Western Europe and beyond the 18th century. And I've joined everyone else in saying that it's hard to define. There just wasn't a set of ideals, or there's no kind of creed. There's not a complete consistency in what the Romantics said and did. They're pushing back on the Enlightenment and sort of the urban industrialization of the day. So I'm going to summarize Romanticism by giving you 5 tendencies. Tendency 1, the heart over the head. So Romantics saw the Enlightenment as this, cold, heartless move towards rationalism. It was an embrace of the scientific revolution. It was all about order and reason. It was this movement that gave you a scientific categorization with, phylum and genus and species and all of that. It gave you dictionaries. It gave you all this kind of precise, ordered development. And they, on the other hand, wanted to go in exactly the opposite direction. So Francis Schaeffer says the Enlightenment, reason was the hero of the Enlightenment, emotion became the hero of Romanticism. One of the early heroes of Romanticism was a young poet named Thomas Chatterton. And you will find a painting of him, very famous painting of him by Henry Wallace. He's from a poor family, but he's pursuing his education, studying hard, starts to publish poetry at 11, but no one's appreciating his poetry. And at the age of 17, he is going to end his own life because he's out of place in this world. But he will become sort of the quintessential romantic, right? This person who's in touch with himself and deep inner experience and longing and beauty and misunderstood, and is going to act out on his emotions even when it cost him his life. There's another example of this. The famous romantic author, German guy Goethe. He is going to write a novel or a short story called The Sorrows of Young Werther. And in this novel, Werther is this young man who falls in love with a woman named Charlotte. Charlotte is married. And people are trying to get to, they're trying to get to Werther and say, look, you need to grow up, you need to stop just, living in your heart, you're infatuated, but it's time to move on. She's married, you need to get a job. I think they wanted him to be a lawyer, and this is just unthinkable. And so he follows his heart and he ends his life. So 3 million copies of this short story are sold. Napoleon calls it the greatest work of European literature to date. And it advocates, it advances this idea that you need to follow your heart. And it changes the way people think about romantic love. People now desire to love and to be loved at the same level of intensity that Werther had for Charlotte. So think of it this way. Chatterton and Werther are the icons of Romanticism. They stand in contrast to the icon of the Enlightenment. And I am thinking of Sir Isaac Newton, who's entirely rational, right? Who sort of uses his mind and reason and science to figure out the physical laws that are governing the universe. And in doing so, he is putting out this mechanistic theory of how the universe works and the immutable laws of nature. And there's this suggestion that every discipline can be broken down to these universal laws and to a mechanistic understanding and appreciation. And this kind of thinking horrifies the Romantics. For them, reducing reality down to these kinds of observations is draining it entirely of its beauty, and it's taking all the mystery out of it, and it's turning humans into thinking machines, and it's ignoring all the important aspects about who we are. Our emotions, our intuition, our imagination, our creativity, our individuality. So the first thing about a romantic is that they are, if the Enlightenment was all head, the Romantics are all heart. Secondly, when it comes to the Romantics, they are about the individual over society. So the philosophies, so this is a way that the Enlightenment thinkers were often termed. So it's as opposed to the Romantics. So the philosophies and the Romantics differ in the sense that the Enlightenment thinkers are all about what's good for the whole, and they're looking and trying to break down the universal norms of people. And the Romantics are focusing on the uniqueness of each person. They do not like the idea of universal norms. They don't like order and classification and definitions and all of that. They felt like every person is unique, and people need to not learn about life from, rules of nature and morality, but that they need to look deep inside their own heart and get in touch with themselves, find their authentic self. So I hope that this is all sort of like, hey, wait, that's sort of what we're doing today. Yes, that's part of the reason I'm pushing down on the Romantics is because history does in some sense, well, if it doesn't repeat itself, doesn't technically repeat itself, but history, as Twain says, sometimes rhymes. A third piece, so we've got the heart over the head, we've got the individual over society, we have the rural over the urban. So we are, remember, moving through the industrial age. The good news of the industrial age is that, not everybody has to work on the farm to have enough food for people to scratch by a living, eke out a living on a 600 calorie a day diet. The good news is that agricultural innovations and other things are now meaning, the plow and the horse-drawn plow and all of these things now means that people are free to go do other things. And you now also have got the development, the application of science, and so you're seeing people move into the cities and move into factories. And this is going to raise collectively the wealth of the nation. Go back to Adam Smith. But it's a difficult and ugly transition. If you read Dickens, you know that. So you've got these bad shops, you've got long hours, you've got exploitation of workers, you've got child labor, and people moving into the cities aren't ready for them, and so you've got a lot of just pollution and a lot of degradation, and the Romantics hate all of this. They love the outdoors, they love nature. Their love for nature sort of often slips into a pantheism or a panentheism. Pan meaning all, universal, theism being God. So God is in all, or panentheism. You make a distinction between whether everything is God and God is also separate from everything, or God is only involved in everything. The difference between pantheism and panentheism. But for the Romantics, the wide outdoors is better than a building, and a poet has a better understanding of nature and human nature than a scientist. And so the scientist is only distorting nature by reducing it to a lifeless machine. In doing so, they're killing the human spirit. So the Romantics disliked science because it's so rational, also because it led to the Industrial Revolution, which was one of their greatest enemies. It not only destroyed the environment, it separated humans from nature, and it turned them into cogs in the machine. Number 4, the Romantics favor the medieval over the classical. So remember, in the Enlightenment, coming out of the medieval ages, coming out of the Middle Ages, coming out of Christendom, the Enlightenment, the Renaissance thinkers are going back to the Romans and the Greeks. They're looking past the 1,000 years of Christendom, past the Middle Ages, back to the classical era. And during the Romantic period, they're not looking back to the classical era, they're looking back to the Middle Ages, to this time of heroic chivalry, to this time of colorful pageantry, to the music and the beauty of the medieval Catholic Church and its rituals and its architecture. They'll start to rebuild some of the Gothic buildings, or they will build buildings and make them look old because they like the old, they like that Middle Ages look. You can see, by the way, why C.S. Lewis and Tolkien are understood to be sort of romantics. Now, there's a sense in which the Romantics often, not exclusively here, again, it's a little hard to nail down everything, but a lot of the Romantics do not embrace Christ, do not embrace the church. Lewis, obviously, and Tolkien do. Lewis is a professor of medieval studies, initially at Cambridge and then at Oxford. So he's all about the Middle Ages and literature out of the Middle Ages. And there's this idea in Lewis and Tolkien that you find in the Romantics that nature is a little magical and mystical, and you've got fairies and talking animals and all this kind of stuff. Well, oh my goodness, that's the Chronicles of Narnia and the Lord of the Rings. The Romantics loved the medieval over the classical. And the fifth thing that I'll say is they were very much, they favored the subjective over the objective. Again, very much a thing that we see today of people saying, truth resides within me, you do you, I'll do me, your truth, my truth, all of that. The Romantics championed subjectivity over objectivity, and this will spill out in their philosophy. And it will eventually give birth to Protestant liberalism, which Schleiermacher is the guy that's going to advance Protestant liberalism, and I'm going to do a whole episode on him, so I won't say a whole lot other than you're going to look for truth inside yourself, and you're going to try and develop this God consciousness, as opposed to the idea that Jesus is truth and that the Word of God is trustworthy and true, and that it means something, right? And that we've got to understand what the meaning of the text is, as opposed to what does it mean to me? No, what does it mean? The application of the text will vary from person to person. But the meaning of the text, I would argue that the text has a meaning, that there is truth, that there is an objective standard. But the Romantics are going to go the opposite direction. And Schleiermacher, sort of embracing some of this Romanticism, is going to lead Protestantism into a liberal turnaround. All that to say, yes, there are some Romantics who are devout in their faith with Christ, but others are not, many are not. And the problem of those who do embrace Christ is that they often do so with a subjectivity that plays a little loose with traditional Apostle Creed doctrines. So, having said all that, let me just double back here and note how a few of the pieces of the puzzle fit together here. For instance, I mentioned back with the Enlightenment, I talked about JeanJacques Rousseau. So you might remember I'm sort of down on Rousseau because he wanted to be this free, spontaneous guy and the free spirit. And he thought children were delightful and that they were uncompromised, and that humans are good, and that it's only society that sort of pulls everything down. Well, humans in a state of nature are great, and children in a state of nature are great, and it's only when we have to live together that everything falls apart. And I said, well, yeah, Rousseau says this. He's never around children because all the children that he fathered, he forced their mothers, none of whom did he marry, he forced them to give their children up because he didn't want to take them to the poorhouse. And he wasn't into being constrained in that way. So he doesn't know that children are not, while wonderful, they're not always a shining example of human goodness. Sometimes there's a little bit of selfishness there. And his idea about the way the world works, and his celebration of emotionalism and his sort of celebration of himself. I think the guy's sort of a cad, but he fits into Romanticism, and so you have Rousseau as the father of the Romantics. A second thing to note is Romantic art. So once you learn that the Romantics or artists during the Romantic era are going to be painting a lot of outdoor scenes, they're going to be painting nature being wonderful and powerful, and they're going to paint people as being sort of small in comparison to nature. You're also going to have, in a lot of Romantic pictures, you're going to have this dark, brooding figure. Again, the Chatterton kind of figure, the Verger kind of figure, who's mysterious and good in one sense, but complicated. And so you'll often have these images of a person in the midst of a storm, and they're dressed in black because yeah, they're sort of complicated. Or you'll have pictures of the beauty of nature. So one of the artists who gets really sort of completely taken by Rousseau's writings, he goes down to Tahiti, where he believes he's going to find on the islands in the South Pacific perfect, idyllic, wonderful, undeveloped people groups. And he will paint what he thinks he's supposed to see. So he paints a lot of Tahitian women, nude women. Van Gogh will paint as a bit as a romantic. And so you've got all the wheat fields and the outdoor things that he's painting. So you also get a little bit of an understanding, not just of Rousseau and of some of the artists, but of Beethoven. His compositions have a passion and an intensity about them that many say just moves all the levers and all the floodgates, and it engages us emotionally in ways that lots of music doesn't. And then after Beethoven, you will have lots of musicians moving down this path. Mendelssohn, Rossini, Brahms, Tchaikovsky, Strauss, Wagner. You're also going to have authors who are going to write about nature, and they're going to write about the idyllic outdoors and the free spirit. And you get a little bit of that with Frankenstein. If you haven't read Frankenstein, by the way, it's not anything perhaps like what you think it's going to be. There is a monster in Frankenstein, but by the end of the book, you understand, oh, that monster is me. It's not the monster that was created. That monster is actually very different. So, but you're going to have a lot of, Victor Hugo, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. The Hunchback is going to have this wild, passionate love for Esmeralda, and Hugo's tying into the fascination with the medieval era. There's a lot of pieces that start to fit together. I find people don't understand Romanticism very well. Let me end by saying, as Christians, I think there's a couple things we can learn from the Romantic era. First, we need to love God with our hearts, not just with our heads. We've been talking about that in the sermon series that's going on right now as I'm recording this. We certainly see in the Psalms, among other places, that there should be an emotional engagement, sort of a passionate trust in God. So, secondly, I think that we could learn from the Romantics in terms of our view of God's creation. Psalm 19 really celebrates it, and there's a sense in which there's a bit of rapture that comes with understanding and appreciating how wonderful, how vast, how powerful nature is. Not that it's deified in any way. Again, some of the Romantics go too far there, but I think that the Romantics can appreciate the power of nature in ways that perhaps we should. And then third, as I said, I just think there's something for us to learn here as we look at a culture that is reacting and responding to the Enlightenment. So today, we're living in what is dubbed post-modernity, or the second wave of post-modernity, which is a pushback on modernity, which is really sort of mirrors the Enlightenment. And Romanticism sort of pushes back on Enlightenment in a similar kind of way that we see today pushing back on modernity. Well, look, there's a lot of things I've not said, a lot of rocks I have not unturned. It's worth noting that the Romantics really get hurt. The whole movement gets hurt by Darwin, because Darwin sort of alerts the world to the fact that nature isn't quite this wonderful, idyllic, everybody gets along kind of place, as he talks about survival of the fittest. It's worth noting that Romanticism leads to expressionism in art. So as opposed to the most precise capture of an image as you could get, something that's coming up out of the emotions and the passions of the artists. It's worth noting that you have people, such as the historian Isaiah Berlin, noting that the Romantics helped pave the way for this idea that sincerity counts more than objectivity, which is, of course, very much in keeping with today. So there's more there, but I think that gives you a taste for the Romantics, and we're going to go in a very different direction with the next episode. If all goes according to plan, I will see you then.